Apart from the euphoric impact of Euro 96, the first sport I really got into as a kid was the World Rally Championship. I began watching just around the time WRC regulations replaced Group A as the premier class of World Rally in 97, and I always stayed up late to watch the highlights and whatever other coverage I could find on terrestrial TV of every event. Rally as a video game subgenre began to flourish and secure mainstream success on home consoles around this time with games like V-Rally and Colin McRae. The most famous example in the arcades was Sega AM3's Sega Rally in late 94 and combined industry-leading 3D graphics and Sega's racing game pedigree. But digging a little bit deeper, a whole series of 2D arcade rally games was actually made by Visco Corporation. So welcome back to the Gamers Garden, where in this episode we're taking a closer look at the Drift Out series, an interesting footnote in the history of arcade racing games from a simpler time. Contextualising things for a moment, there were few rally racing games made by this point on any platform, let alone in the arcades. Namco's Rally X was hugely popular when it released in 1980, but apart from having rally in the title, it doesn't reflect the sport. Lombard RAC Rally was a technically impressive rally game that went as full simulation as you could in 1988 on the Amiga. But apart from a handful of other disparate titles, rally as a video game subgenre was very uncommon, which brings us on to Visco Corporation. Tetsuya Akiyama established Visco Corporation out of Kyoto in 1983. Visco's first handful of games were for the arcade, usually working closely with Taito, and unsurprisingly consisted of mostly vertical scrolling shooters that were popular at the time. In 1990 they would start developing and releasing a handful of games for the NES, but it was in 91 that they released their original Drift Out game, an overhead arcade rally game with a vertical screen format that ran on an expanded version of Taito's F1 system board. Drift Out shows off its tech right at the attract mode. The title scales in with the background tile and sprite rotation on display behind it. From here you enter your 3-letter name and go on to choose one of the fake but very recognisable rally cars. This series will go on to secure licenses as you'll see later, but it's charming to see Mitsubishi, the Ford and the Toyota, among others, on this car select screen. Once you've chosen your preferred unlicensed rally car, you're put in a championship table of similarly close to real life named drivers and stage 1 begins. The F1 board had a powerful sprite engine already, and it was quite versatile, with many different games having their own custom expansion boards added for different graphical effects. Drift Out used a custom graphic chip that allowed for its smooth sprite rotation and mild scaling effects. The overall effect is great at first, super smooth, colourful, and with toy-like car models that kick out and rotate for the drift when handled correctly. The sound is fine as well. The howling engine is pretty authentic, giving it a 2D racing game from 91, and typical of the time music plays behind it with the occasional bit of crowd cheering to break things up. Anyone who's played an overhead SNES Mode 7 racer will immediately be at home, but a flaw from that style of racing game does become apparent. The problem with this kind of top-down, background and sprite rotation approach is that your field of view is limited and the collision detection is incredibly inconsistent. Your cars need a good bit of space to lose traction and begin a drift, but the track design doesn't really allow for that often enough. It's satisfying when you launch into a hairpin with a well-timed drift, but all too often you'll clip a bit of trackside detail that runs very closely alongside the actual course. With no space to drift in, you often come to a complete stop, or worse, be thrown in the wrong direction. Your opponents become moving roadblocks, where the lightest touch slows you down rather than being a thrilling challenge for you. I changed the dip switches to easy, but could still make very little progress in Drift Out, and I really put some practice in. The cars offer a little variety, but all I found was that the fastest cars needed even more space to initiate a good drift, something the tracks just don't give you often enough. The direction arrows also don't help much either, as they rotate themselves relative to the screen's position. This results in them wildly spinning around as you fight to stay on track, and it just often confuses more than it helps. Mix that with the narrow, vertically orientated screen that feels more appropriate to a scrolling shooter, and unfortunately, Drift Out feels too flawed to be considered some kind of hidden arcade gem. I don't want to be too harsh here, as it's an interesting game, and is technically quite strong, but it feels quite difficult to get into it looking back. Now, accurate production details of any kind are difficult to ascertain for video games from this time, but it looks like another rally game released just days later in Japanese arcades on the 8th of November, Thrash Rally, on the Neo Geo MVS platform. Another top-down rally racer, Thrash Rally was technically less ambitious. The quite severe rotation effect of drift out is something that looks fantastic but makes it rather tough to play, and Thrash Rally is easier game to jump into now, considering the tracks don't wrap around themselves like in Drift Out. There was quite a gap until the next Drift Out game, and during that time, Galeco released World Rally in February 1993, a game you'll see clearly influenced how the Drift Out series would proceed. World Rally is a difficult game to enjoy with rather muddy low-resolution visuals and a heavy feeling to the car handling that makes putting the car into a drift on long turns too tricky. There's a great mechanic that Drift Out will steal later though, and we'll come back to that shortly. The first sequel to Drift Out would arrive 3 years later with Drift Out 94, The Hard Order. The Attract mode shows off its now licensed collection of cars with some good looking pre-rendered images, before showing off the new isometric viewpoint. In fairness, this feels like a completely new game, and it's kind of a sequel in name only. You enter your now 4-character name and choose a nationality, before selecting one of the real world cars and seeing a truly ugly world map that shows you where the next stage is taking place. Visco worked with Sammy and Sata to develop and release the SSV arcade board somewhere around 93, a 32-bit system that used dual-layer PCBs. The SSV board was home to a range of puzzle, pachinko, mahjong and vertical shooters, but Drift Out 94 would be its only racing-style game. Visually, with a 3-year difference in hardware, it's a very big step up from the original Drift Out. The vertical aspect ratio is gone, replaced by a more standard 4:3 ratio that serves you far better in navigating the courses. The isometric view negates the need for a rotating background layer now. So although the camera still swings from side to side smoothly, you're never turning back on yourself, instead always moving sideways or upward on the screen along the static environments. Although using the same isometric style, Drift Out 94 looks like it's a much higher resolution than World Rally, and it's better for it. The background music has that jazzy pop style that was again typical of its time, but somehow the engine sounds are worse, although there are now digitised voice samples of your co-driver that are quite difficult to understand due to a very strong sounding compression. For all the extra power in the SSV board, Drift Out 94 feels a little slow, and it's a mixed bag as an improvement over the original. A lot of the roads and country lanes look fine, but once on the safari style tracks, there's so much detail on the screen it becomes very difficult to follow the road. Control is an issue. Making a good racing game with just digital input must always be a challenge for developers, but here the cars just aren't responsive enough to the joystick inputs. You can throw them into a full drift now on the bigger turns, but on exiting the turn, you need to input the exact amount of opposite lock to keep your car straight, otherwise the next straight is spent overcorrecting this. Now this is a problem that Galeco's World Rally has already solved. When you're inputting left or right, you're moving the car across the road and setting how much of a drift you're going to go for. They then automatically straighten up on the exit as long as you've got them roughly in the right direction. This is the main reason why Drift Out 94 feels difficult to handle in comparison, and even with a lot of practice you just can't relax enough to get into a rhythm and enjoy the game properly. Drift Out 94 was a step in the right direction, but it feels like a work in progress game, and as we'll see later, Visco learnt the lessons they needed to in this game so that they could go on to produce something truly special. Before Visco would release the most famous version of Drift Out, they actually published an entry on Super Famicom in 1995 called Super Drift Out. This was the only Drift Out game purely for home consoles, and not developed in-house, with Dragnet taking that on, a company that I could not find a thing out about. Released in Japan only, as a finished North American release was planned by Accolade but never materialised, Super Drift Out goes back to the original style as a top-down racer and uses the Super Famicom's infamous Mode 7 to create a large rotating background layer for the tracks. Once you get past some truly ugly digitised rally photos, you select from a small range of game modes, enter your name, then choose from a now familiar list of licensed cars. They're shown as nice pre-rendered sprites here, but it's the only time you'll see them in this way, as in-game we're back to the toy car-like style of the original Drift Out. Technically, Super Drift Out looks quite impressive in the way many SNES games that use this effect look. The rotation is smooth, scrolling is quick, and the little cars are twitchy with a nice shifting shadow that feels just like the arcade original. Side by side, the Super Famicom holds up quite well to an arcade game of the same time as the console's release. The engine noise and sound effects are nice enough, but the music has little variety and gets old quickly. Given the praise I can give Super Drift Out, unfortunately, again, it's not a hugely enjoyable game. And this time it comes down to one main reason: track design. Now, the obvious benefit of using Mode 7 for this game style is that the developer can recreate the look and feel of Drift Out and take advantage of a wider aspect ratio, which gives you a much better view of the upcoming track. Unfortunately, due to the limitations of Mode 7, there's such a low limit in place for the overall size of the track that they have to twist, turn and wrap around each other, so much so that you're never going straight and building up speed more than a handful of seconds at most, right before you need to slow down again and slowly navigate another 90-degree turn. This kind of driving is part of real rally, of course, but it's to such an extent in Super Drift Out that, coupled with the lack of variation of types of turn, the gameplay feels like a repetitive slog very quickly. You simply spend more time turning a sharp corner than going forward at speed, and is very reminiscent of a Scalextric track. There's a lot of cool things about Super Drift Out. The graphics are nice with some good effects like the car headlights on nighttime stages. It has a well-made and simple to use track editor, but it feels like the decision to use the Mode 7 in a top-down style not only makes the game, but limits it too. Drift Out's one-time foray as a home console exclusive isn't a huge success. It's another interesting stepping stone in an interesting series though, but now we're about to see what Visco could do with everything that they had learned so far. The final, and I would argue best game in the series, is Neo Drift Out, released on the Neo Geo MVS arcade platform in March 1996. The MVS was an arcade board by SNK that used interchangeable ROM cartridges. This meant arcade operators could upgrade to the latest SNK games without having to buy entirely new cabinets or arcade boards. It was a response to Capcom's similar style CPS board from 1988. And by the mid-90s, the MVS had matured into an excellent arcade platform that was home to popular games in a wide variety of genres. Visco had developed a small number of MVS games by 96, most notably Breakers, a very approachable one-on-one fighting game, and they would go on to release MVS games right up until 2000. Neo Drift Out picks up from the isometric style of Drift Out 94, with a key improvement taken from Galco's World Rally. Simply put, the car control in Neo Drift Out is fantastic. Using only left or right on the digital controls of an arcade joystick, each of the now just 3 licensed cars has a momentum, balance and responsiveness that allows you to execute highly satisfying power slides around the tracks in this game. The cars respond very quickly with just the right amount of weight. Long turns can be tackled with big power slides with just a few flicks of the joystick, and the cars auto-correct to straighten up when exiting turns, taking the best feature from Galco's World Rally and solving the biggest issue of Drift Out 94. Neo Drift Out is also the strongest technical entry in the series, taking advantage of the MVS to produce the fastest and most aesthetically consistent Drift Out game. After the obligatory MVS How to Play screen, you choose one of the 3 most iconic rally cars of the time. From the stage start, your car is quick to accelerate, and as the speed picks up, the camera subtly zooms out to give you a wider view of the track ahead. This simple but beautifully done scaling effect is used whenever your speed adjusts, and it makes the gameplay feel very dynamic as you swing around the turns. The entire visual style is far more consistent here than in Drift Out 94, and the cars kick out just the right amount to look good, but also make sense visually when exiting the turn. If there's an area that Neo Drift Out lacks, it's in car and track variety. With only 3 cars, most players should pick the fastest one, the Toyota, to stand a chance of completing the game without lowering the difficulty too much. And one area where Neo is actually weaker than Drift Out 94 is that there are less environments this time around, and they repeat more often. A small amount of content even for an arcade game really is the only fault I can put against Neo Drift Out though. After digging through quite a lot of the Neo Geo MVS library over the last year, this really is one of my favourite games on the platform. It didn't see a release on the AES, SNK's home version of the MVS, but in that same year it did release on the Neo Geo CD, a CD-based version of the MVS that SNK produced to try and provide a lower cost way to get their games into players' homes. Neo Drift Out is an excellent example of an arcade game. It's a well-designed, fast game that requires reflexes like the best classic arcade games, and its gameplay doesn't feel aged at all. And that's the Drift Out series by Visco Corporation. 3 arcade games and 1 outlying home console version across 5 years. Visco is still in business, purely making slot machines, as at the turn of the millennium, the company turned their back on their small but significant contribution to the arcades. The isometric arcade racing game may not have made a huge impact historically, but from the games we've seen here, along with some others I haven't mentioned, show that it's an interesting subgenre in its own right to look at. And while rally racing would go on to be a highly successful mainstream genre in the home console generations to come, Drift Out was a step along that path, and the series, particularly in Neo Drift Out, are more than worth a go today. Thank you very much for watching, and please leave a comment if you've ever played any of the Drift Out series or if you're discovering them for the first time. And until the next time, happy gaming.